my name is Tony. With continued exposure, a familiarity nurtured over decades, you would imagine, and quite rightly, the effect a film has would lessen. Certainly it does. The element of surprise, for instance, is short-circuited because you know what's going to happen and when and how. But The Haunting, no matter how many times I see it, still generates unease, trepidation, and continues to impose that creeping, tingling sensation in the nape of the neck because of the way it is composed, shot, and executed. The unparalleled atmosphere it radiates from every single frame goes right through your eyes and ears into the base reptilian primal part of the brain. Like Psycho or Jaws, it tickles that prehistoric receptor, that ancient nerve, and invokes disturbance and discord. Fear, by any other name. Not intense, not paralyzing, but gentle, insidious, sly, probing, knowing. It pushes buttons with icy precision. That's what it does. Director Robert Wise island hopped genres with elegant ease. Horror, western, war movies, crime dramas, science fiction, historical dramas, comedies, musicals. If there was a genre with which he felt most comfortable, I don't know what it was. He maintained a consistent baseline standard irrespective of the type and quality of the material he was working with. That standard often extended and evolved into higher levels of creative artistry, elevating many of his films to classic status. The Haunting is the Eiger of haunted house movies, the pinnacle of the genre to which all others aspire and against which all others will be measured and evaluated. It's a benchmark. If you want to know how to do it, The Haunting is the textbook guide. Yep, you could dismiss it as an old hat, but along with Jack Clayton's The Innocents, it sets the gold standard. Based on American author Shirley Jackson's 1959 novel The Haunting of Hill House, the screenplay, which stripped things back, was written by Nelson Gidding. Gidding initially felt the book was less to do with ghosts and more to do with mental illness. When he met with Shirley Jackson, she contradicted his theory, informing that it was definitely about the supernatural. This meant he had to make some changes to the script he just spent 6 months writing. Could have saved himself some time if he'd consulted with Jackson beforehand, maybe. But hey, where's the fun in that? Still, it worked out well, as he included elements of mental ill health which bring to bear some ambiguity to the narrative. How much is supernatural? How much is a product of a fractious mental state, a disassociation with reality? The Haunting kicks off with a prologue narrated by Dr. John Markway, Richard Johnson. A disturbing one too. Hill House is an elaborate bespoke construction, designed as a home by a rich but domineering doofus called Hugh Crane, for him and his wife and daughter Abigail to live in. The wife's coach inexplicably crashes into a tree as she's arriving at the place for the first time, and she dies. Crane marries again, but his new wife clumsily falls down a flight of stairs in Hill House and she dies. After Crane dies, Abigail never leaves the nursery. When she's old and infirm, a nurse companion moves in to care for her. One night, in physical distress, the old girl calls for the companion, only she's too busy getting her rocks off with a boyfriend to hear. After the death of her employer, the companion inherits the house, but it doesn't do her much good as she hangs herself from the spiral staircase in the library. On the whole, and with reflection, Hill House seems a little bit rough on women. The property, uninhabited for decades, is now owned by a distant relative of the companion, a Mrs. Sanderson, and she's granted Dr. Markway permission to investigate it for paranormal activity. See, it's got something of a reputation for being haunted. There's a small catch though, and that is Mrs. Sanderson's nephew and beneficiary Luke, Russ Tamblyn, must be allowed to accompany the good doctor and the other members of his team. Luke is going to assess the property which will one day be his. The other members of Markway's team are two women, Theodora or Theo, Claire Bloom, and Eleanor or Nell, Julie Harris. Both have experience of the paranormal. Theo is a psychic and Nell was the victim of poltergeist activity at her home when she was a child. They rock up at Hill House, move in, and we're off. Because the film represents on a certain level something of a rolling character study, it's worth considering who and what the main players are. The men are less of the focused and catalysts than the women. Markway prioritizes his investigation, his research work. He is considerate and concerned, shows kindness to Nell, which she misinterprets as interest of a potentially romantic nature. She is attracted to and falls for Markway without considering if he might be involved with or even married to someone else. He doesn't notice, doesn't clock clock how disturbed, toxically attached and mentally fragile Nell is. Luke is instantly attracted to Theo, which is a hide into nowhere as he's really not her type. He's a flippant young guy fixated on plans and schemes about what he could do with the property to make money. He's a skeptic, believes in the tangibility of cash generation, but certainly doesn't believe in ghosts. Sort of a jerk, but with a soft centre. Nell is shy, socially awkward, starved of affection, lived her whole life at the beck and call of her sickly mother, who she lived with and cared for until her death, which she fears she may have wished upon her. The term downtrodden could have been coined with her in mind. Hopelessly neurotic, self-deprecating, mentally delicate, continuously hovering on the edge of a psychological breakdown, she is the most vulnerable to whatever influences are at play in Hill House. Theo is strikingly beautiful, stylish, modern. Claire Bloom's outfits were styled by London fashionista Mary Quant. A strong, self-determined female who, it is persuasively implied, is a lesbian. A brave move for the time. She is attracted to Nell and, of course, impervious to any underlying charms Markway or Luke may possess. Wise, with his casting of Bloom, subverts the absurd stereotype very prevalent at the time that lesbians generally present as mannish and unfeminine. Theo is a male sexual fantasy made flesh and completely unattainable. How frustrating. The group dynamic has its fair share of sexual tension and complex conflict spiking through it. The ghosts and ghostly goings-on. You never see anything. Everything is either implied or invisible to the eye. And the two men don't experience much that the women do. Apart from an encounter with a cold spot in the house where exhaled breath is seen as vapour and the temperature drops to freezing. They all experience that. Theo and Nell share a room, and they hear ear-splitting, thumping, banging sounds, the things that go bump in the night. When something tries to gain access to the room, the door bulges alarmingly inward. Nell hears voices and a child crying, but is it for real or is it in her head? One of the standout scenes, guaranteed to raise the fine hairs on first viewing, occurs when Nell and Theo have pushed their beds together. In the dark, Nell holds Theo's hand. We hear her internal monologue telling how tight and icy Theo's grip is, crushing her fingers. When the lights go on, Nell is seen to have moved to a couch on the other side of the room. It wasn't Theo holding Nell's hand. She was nowhere nearby. Was it for real, or was it in Nell's head? There is so much going on in the haunting that takes place before your eyes without you consciously realising it. This is all down to the way it's shot and made, and it's a masterclass of audience manipulation achieved through incisive direction, immaculate scripting, camera work, sound and set design. You've got an atonal score by Humphrey Searle that absolutely pulsates with menacing discordant atmosphere. Ambient sound effects, voices, whispers, shouts further contribute to the effect, along with Nell's sometimes feverish, sometimes dreamy internal monologues. The cinematography by Davis Bolton is something else. At times, he and Wise used an experimental 30mm Panavision lens that contained peripheral distortions, adding a veneer of visual unease and making corridors and rooms seem longer. Nell, who becomes the focus of events, is often shot from above, giving the impression she has been watched and tracked by the house itself, possibly. Unusual pans and tracking shots were employed, high and low angles, to induce a sense of off-kilter spatial disorientation in the viewer. So when someone exits a room from the right, they enter the next room from the left, resulting in the viewer being unable to process clear awareness of which rooms and hallways connect to each other. The house itself is suggested to be the monster of the piece, so to speak, a living entity enhanced by exterior shots being filmed to make it look as if the windows are eyes. Lighting effects distort temporality, so you don't know on times if the action is taking place by day or night. For instance, when Markway seeks to rescue the disturbed Nell from the unstable spiral staircase, some windows have sunlight streaming in, whilst others are in darkness. An entire book could be written detailing the practical effects, tricks and techniques utilised in this film. The creative thought and care that went into every shot and sound, word and image is on a par with anything Hitchcock ever did. Julie Harris is perfect as Nell. During filming, she was suffering with a bout of clinical depression. I doubt being in this sort of film did a lot to lift her mood, but on the other hand, her mental state must have added realism to her characterization. Events take place mostly from her perspective. She builds a naive romantic fantasy in her head, imagining a future with Markway. This is demolished by the arrival of Markway's skeptical wife, Grace Lois Maxwell. Grace decides to sleep the night in the nursery where Abigail Crane lived and died, cause she ain't afraid of no ghosts. ghost. A mistake. Markway warns that the nursery is likely the source of the disturbances in the house, but Grace will have none of it. As a result, she goes missing, and this is the trigger point for escalation to the tragic and chilling climax. Claire Bloom is gorgeous and sexy as Cleo, and as previously mentioned, for the time her performance and the way her character is written establishes a positive and respectful representation of lesbianism beyond the stereotypical. She's given a sharp, slightly cruel sense of humour used to emphasise Nell being something of an outsider and misfit. Cleo is so cool and self-confident, Nell the exact opposite. Richard Johnson's Markway is a considerate and kindly soul while also being an invested professional. Johnson gives a very natural and thoughtful performance. Even Russ Tamblyn manages to impress beyond his cute beefcake for teen girls image. It's his best screen role in my opinion. His Luke Sanderson is a glib, flash, jokey chancer in preppy collegiate duds, always on the lookout for ways to make a buck from his inheritance. In the end though, he concludes that as far as Hill House is concerned,
it ought to be burned down and the ground sowed with salt.
Finally, Nelson Giddings' screenplay is nothing short of superb. The intricate narrative structure, the compelling dialogue and character interactions, it's the ideal framework for Wise to work his magic within. Another stellar example of the screenwriter's craft accomplishing a showcase of singular expertise. The Haunting was made in black and white, and that's the way it was intended to be and the way it should always be seen. In 1990, Wise invoked a clause in his contract when media mogul Ted Turner wanted to colorize it. The clause conveniently decreed the movie could only be in black and white. Why that clause was there, I'm unsure. Pity there wasn't a clause that prevented it being remade by idiots. If you've seen the excruciating garbage director Jan DuBont belched out in 1999, I've a feeling you would agree. This CGI tripathon had Liam Neeson, Lily Taylor, Catherine Zeta-Jones and Owen Wilson in it. Comparing it with the original is like comparing the artistry of a lit Gwyneth Paltrow This Smells Like My Vag candle planted in a Dayglow cowpat with Michelangelo's David. It might have been the very moment when Hollywood had its first real epiphany of, let's just make nothing more than arrant, ruinous, incestuous shit from now on, is what people want, because apparently it made some money. I despair, I really do. Especially because nowadays we moved on, folks. It no longer matters if hideous trash nets some profit or not, it'll get made anyway. The agenda will be pursued regardless. The only reason to watch it is Owen Wilson getting thrown into a huge fireplace, standing up in the ashes, then getting killed by a big stone lion head swinging down to bite his own head off at the neck. Yes, that does actually happen, and yes, I did fucking laugh through the veil of bitter tears. Earlier, Stephen King wanted to remake it with Steven Spielberg. Luckily, he never did. Instead, coming up with a haunted house miniseries called Rose Red. I don't know whether he was off the booze and drugs by this time, but judging by the monstrous crap fest that was Rose Red, I conclude that he didn't want to go to rehab just yet. Then there was a reimagining, as the term goes, on Netflix as a streaming series under the auspice The Haunting of Hill House, which was 10 episodes of turgid, overwrought, dysfunctional family dynamics peppered with a skipload of repetitive jump scares. I didn't mind it actually. Well, not too much anyway. At least it didn't do anything massively transgressive to associate itself with or piss over the original. The Haunting is cinematic genius of the meticulous, painstakingly plotted and perceptive, emotionally intelligent and frightening kind. Like Hitchcock, Wise can conceive of scenes and how to compose them to get the audience response he wants. He knows if he slowly cranks tension by having a mentally disturbed Julie Harris climb a rusting spiral staircase with the restraining bolts coming loose and then suddenly breaks that tension with Lois Maxwell's pallid, dirt and tear-streaked face suddenly looming down at her from the ceiling in close-up, he'll get a reaction alright. First time viewing, I nearly shit my pants. That is how you escalate towards and pull off a jump scare. Take note, amateurs. By now you've probably gleaned some inkling that I rate this film highly. If not, then I've either done something wrong or you're not as astute as you thought. Just to be clear then, this is one of the best films ever made. Not just in the horror fantasy genre, but in any genre. Like so many classic works of cinematic art, it took decades to bed in, gain some appreciation, build its reputation. It wasn't a big financial or critical hit at the time. In fact, some critics labelled it boring and uneventful. Shirley Jackson herself declared that she nearly fell asleep. I have no idea what they were watching, but it wasn't the same thing as me. Later, Martin Scorsese deemed it the scariest horror film of all time. Steven Spielberg, the scariest film ever made. My inclination, based on my own experiences, is to go with those who might know a little something about making, watching, and enjoying films. Thanks as always for your time and attention. Please feel free to do whatever you choose to do next. Hit like, don't like, comment, subscribe, check out my early access Patreon thing, or even make a welcome financial contribution via the thanks button. I'm off to a place where whatever walks there walks alone. Yes, my kitchen, to warm up a corned beef pasty for my lunch. God, do I know how to live. Catch you later, pilgrims.